I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. Sorry. I'll just remind everybody for those who are following along in the text, we're actually on page 290, but I'm just going to go back for a second to a few pages earlier. So just a reminder, we're in the section now on ultimate truths. And I'm sort of going to review just for a second, so to remind us that, so Lama Tsongkhapa in this text, right, has been pointing out that, he repeatedly points out from what perspective, right, like, in the sense that, conventional truths, he sometimes says, are true for the mind, what's this, like truths for a mind that's concealed, for a conventional mind, or for a mind for which the actual nature of things is concealed, right? That's one kind of conventional truth. Then for a Buddha, there are also like what they call mere conventionalities, mere dependent arisings, or something like that. But so conventional truths are true for a mind, for a certain kind of mind, right? And Chandrakirti sometimes says they're true to the world for an ordinary discussion, right? And then when he gets this, now we're in the right now we're in the section on ultimate truths, right? And he says at the very beginning of the section, when he's defining them, he points out that they're true. He says they are found by an uncontaminated, exalted wisdom comprehending suchness. Right. So, ultimate truths are true in a sense, for an ultimate mind, right? For a mind that's engaged in ultimate analysis on the nature of reality, and that's seeing emptiness directly. Just reminding us of that. Make sense? So, it's actually quite interesting, isn't it? As soon as he says this point, right, about that conventional truths are truths for a certain kind of mind, right, are truths that are perceived by a certain kind of mind, let's put it that way. Ultimate truths are truths perceived by a different kind of mind, right? A mind of meditative equipoise, of an Arya that's engaged in, the meditative equipoise on the ultimate nature of reality and is perceiving it directly. This is my own reflection now, that's isn't what Lama Tsongkhapa is saying here, but already there's an implication of, right, that even conventional truths are dependently arisen, right? Ultimate truths are dependent, right? They both exist dependent upon a mind, isn't it? Right? Whereas conventional truth is conventional because it exists to a certain kind of mind. Ultimate truths are ultimate because they exist, because they're ultimately true, but also because they exist for a mind that's perceiving ultimate truths, right? So I'm just reminding folks of that. So now we're up to the section on page 290, where he talks about the divisions of ultimate truths. And we'll start there. Just go through it. So he says, when ultimate truths are divided, it is in accordance with the explanation in Chandrakirti's commentary to the Middle Way, or sometimes supplement to the Middle Way. That's the text that Gyume Khenpo She's been teaching. And he's, we'll continue teaching in a few months, pretty soon. And so Chandrakirti, as he mentions, lists, and this is based on the Prajnaparamita Sutras. Right? Chandrakirti is basing his commentary on the Sutras of the Buddha, the Prajnaparamita. And so he points out that in one part of that text, he lists 16 types of emptiness, or emptinesses, examples of emptiness, you could say. And then he lists 4. The intermediate, that's the extensive. The extensive version is 16. Then there's an intermediate version, which is 4. And he lists, Lama Tsongkhapa lists the 4. The emptiness of things, the emptiness of non-things, or I would say, we talked about those as conditioned and unconditioned, right? The uncompounded. So really it's talking about the emptiness of the compounded phenomena that have arisen due to causes and conditions, the emptiness of uncompounded phenomena, the emptiness of self, like of oneself, and the emptiness of other. So anyway, that's another list. And then he says, or if you want to summarize it into just a list of two things, then it would be the selflessness of persons and the selflessness of phenomena. And persons would be one's own self. Phenomena could be one's own aggregates, like one's body, one's consciousness, or it could be external phenomena also. So up to that point, it's quite interesting, isn't it? Because he's talking about divisions of ultimate truth. So he goes through there, right? The 16, which he doesn't list, by the way, the 4 which he lists, and the 2 which he lists. And now he's going to go into a long, almost like another way of dividing them. So he says other texts. So that's because those lists are according to Chandrakirti, right? Who's a Prasangika Majamaka who Tsongkhapa's been following very closely here. Now he mentions a different way of subdividing the two truths, ultimate truths rather, which is, and he's using Kamala Shila's illumination of the middle way. So he says other texts, and he begins with that one, but there are various texts that do this. Set forth 2 actual ultimates and concordant ultimates. And so this is a different way of dividing ultimate truths. Does that make sense up to that point? So and now he's going to actually explore this one. The others I think are pretty the 16 he's not getting into. The 4 and the 2 he's already kind of explained, but now he's going to go into detail about this one, actual ultimates and concordant ultimates. I want to say I think the reason he's going to it's hard to know why Tsongkhapa does what he does, but I think if you read it, it's fairly self-evident that he's going to explore those in detail, in large part because they've been misunderstood and they're easy to misunderstand. Whereas the others he's already explained pretty clearly. So he quotes Kamala Shila. And remember, Kamala Shila was an Indian master, right, who came to Tibet and was a student of Shantarakshita. So here's the quote. Non-production accords with the ultimate and is therefore called an ultimate, but actually it is not, because in actuality the ultimate is beyond all elaborations. Now next he quotes Shantarakshita, who's Kamala Shila's teacher, who wrote Ornament for the Middle Way. And that quote says, since it accords with the ultimate, this is called an ultimate. If it really were, it would be free from all the hosts of elaborations. And then he quotes Jananagarba's Two Truths, where he doesn't quote it actually, he just says it's stated similarly there, and in the auto commentary on the Truths, also by Jananagarba, as well as in the Ornament of Mahayana Sutras, it is explained that the negation of ultimately existent production and the like is conventionally existent. So here you get the point. It is what Lama Tsongkhapa often does this, right? So he's saying, first you notice, I'm going to point out a few things. One is, Lama Tsongkhapa, as you've probably been noticing, right, almost always bases his sort of main presentation on Indian works, right? So he's quoting all Indian masters. Just the other day, actually, I was reading, where was it? Oh, it was in a book about Mahamudra, but it was pointing out that even in Tsongkhapa's, like many times Tibetan teachers will write a book at some point in their life that's a list of teachings received. Like, so they'll just describe like what the teachings are that they've received and from whom, and what the lineage is. And he points at that, the author rather, points out that Tsongkhapa, even in his list of teachings received, he only mentions the Indian, like works that could be traced back to Indian teachers. So he received many other teachings that were sort of Tibetan compositions, but he doesn't, I thought that was intriguing. Most Tibetans nowadays would list, for example, if they received the teaching of Tsongkhapa's, they would list, I received from, such and such teacher, this teaching by Lama Tsongkhapa, and you can trace it back to Tsongkhapa himself, or if they were teaching by Marpa or Sakya Pandita, they would describe. But Tsongkhapa only talks about teachings he received that came from these kinds of Indian masters. So that's how much he emphasized, what's the word? Like his Holy Dalai Lama does, actually, right? How often does his Holy Dalai Lama talk about the Nalanda tradition, He's always talking about that, right? That we practice the Nalanda tradition, and it can be traced back to Nalanda Monastic University and the Tanka there, right? The 16 great pandits of Nalanda, or 17? 16 or 17? 17 great pandits of Nalanda. That's right. So that tendency, Tsongkhapa also had that, right? To really emphasize. So you can see he's quoting these Indian masters. And he said, and what he's pointing out there is that a couple things are being pointed out here. One is, this is another way, I mean, this is not just something made up, right? There is this kind of, there are many Indian texts that talk about actual ultimates and concordant ultimates. And then he's making another point here, right? Which is that concordant ultimates, right, which are not actual ultimates, are not actual ultimates because they're not free of the hosts of elaborations. That's the phrase he uses, right? And so, actually, I just pause there for a second. So what does that mean? Like, he's going to explain it, right, obviously. But it's useful to pause, I think, at moments like that and to go, okay, so he's saying there are actual ultimates and they're concordant ultimates. Concordant ultimates concord with the actual, but they're not actual because they're not beyond all elaborations. And if you pause and contemplate it, first of all, it's hard to know for sure, right? This is one of the challenges of reading the Indian works without commentary. And as you can guess from the way Tsongkhapa's been treating things like this, right, he's going to bring up next ways people misunderstood that, right? And so, and then he's going to present the actual meaning of that. So, but so I just want to, I'm just pausing there because I think it's useful to kind of reflect. Okay, beyond all elaborations, they're concordant with the ultimate, but they're not the actual ultimate. What's the actual? And we know what the actual ultimate is, right? I just want to point that out because I just reminded us. That's why I reminded us. The actual ultimate is, right, a mind is that which is perceived, right, by the mind of an Arya, right, who's seeing emptiness directly, while they're in meditative equipoise directly by special exalted wisdom, right? That special exalted wisdom is the mind of meditative equipoise, right? So they're in meditation directly perceiving emptiness, and that emptiness they're perceiving is the ultimate truth. Does that make sense? That's what we already said. So we know the actual ultimate is that because you already said that. But the question is going to be, what's the concordant ultimate then, right? Sorry, Gabe, you had a question.
No, I was just getting caught in the elaboration part of it, but no.
We'll come back to it.
What do we mean by elaborations here? Is it descriptions, objectifications of ultimate truth? Or?
That's the right question, I think, in part. There is he'll answer it, so I don't want to, but that's the right question to start wondering about. What does it mean to say elaborations? Does it mean elaborations of inherent existence, for example? Or true existence? Does it mean appearances of things? Like, does it mean other kinds of mental constructs? That's the right question, I think, and he's going to explore that. So now he says, I'm going to read the header of section 2 now, right? That was section 1. The header of section 2. How masters of earlier generations explain the entity of the ultimate set forth in those texts. And remind everybody, right, when he says, how masters of earlier generations, first of all, he's talking about Tibetans now, right, mostly. And what he said, I actually, in my own personal copy, I wrote a little thing. How masters of earlier generations incorrectly explain. He doesn't say that because he's very polite. I think that's interesting. Tsongkhapa is like that, isn't he? He's very like, but what he's getting at is this is a slightly wrong explanation. So he says, with respect to the meaning of those statements, many earlier masters differentiate two ultimate truths. And he says, specified and unspecified ones. They assert that the emptiness which negates ultimate production and so forth with regard to form and the like is the former, meaning specified, and imputed ultimate with the characteristics of a conventional truth, and the latter cannot be made the object of any mind whatsoever, so it is not an object of knowledge. And so I want to pause there. You can already tell, right? If you've been following Tsongkhapa carefully, you can tell he's not going to agree with that view, right? part of the reason why is look at the last clause, right? It is not an object of knowledge, right? Earlier in the same section, he said, if ultimate truth is not an object of knowledge, then the whole path, then why would a bodhisattva, right? There was a whole section where he said, then what's the point of a bodhisattva making effort for 3 countless great eons at realizing the ultimate truth, if there's no ultimate truth to be known, right? If it's not an object of knowledge. And then a Buddha doesn't know, if it's not an object of knowledge, then the Buddha doesn't know the ultimate truth, right? Then there's no meaning of Buddha. Then the whole path system falls apart. And, part of the Buddha's whole point was that he knew, Buddha knew that both conventional, part of the definition of a Buddha is the Buddha knows both conventional truths and ultimate truths, and so on. So, some teachers have said, right, and actually, I want to point out something else, like, this is some former Tibetan masters he's addressing, right, who interpret those things that way. But there are still people who interpret it that way, actually. If you read carefully, you'll come across phrases like that, like it's unknowable, right? Or, which Tsongkhapa is saying that he disagrees with that. Right? He's saying it is something that can be known by a specific kind of knower, right? Meaning a certain kind of mind. Anyway, so I'll leave that at that. So he says, those texts, next heading, those texts explaining the 2 ultimates are not meant to refer to objects only. Okay, so now comes the section that's subtle in a way. Actually, this whole next section I think is a bit subtle. Did people try to read it?
No.
I wasn't sure. I was like, wow. Okay, so since that is not, now he says it very directly, since that is not the meaning of those texts, right? So he's already saying it. That interpretation by some former Tibetans is not the correct meaning of those texts by those great Madhyamikas. They should be explained like this. The object, reality, must indeed be taken as an ultimate. But the subject, a reasoning consciousness, is also often explained as such. Now, this is where it's going to get subtle. So I was going to do this later, but I'll do it now. I want to point something out. He's going to make 2 different kinds of distinctions in a way here as we go forward. He already made the first one, which is sometimes I'm trying to say it the right way. One way, sometimes, actually, I'll say it this way. Sometimes we talk about what he's going to say, concordant ultimate and actual ultimate, right? The actual ultimate is emptiness, right? Is the emptiness perceived in direct perception by a special exalted wisdom, right? One kind of distinction, which is actually the least, this is going to be the simpler kind, actually. The next one's going to be much more subtle. One simple way to differentiate these is that we can sometimes say the mind that perceives such an emptiness is an ultimate mind, right? Because it's perceiving the ultimate truth, and it's that ultimate analysis. And so sometimes sometimes in text that will be sometimes like in discussion that will be called ultimate or ultimate truth, even though it's not actually the ultimate truth. It's the perceiver of the ultimate truth. Does that make sense? So when he says here, the object, reality, meaning emptiness, must indeed be taken as the ultimate, but the subject, meaning a mind, a reasoning consciousness, is also often explained as such, right? So there he's saying that point. Does that make sense? So he's saying the actual ultimate is that which is perceived, meaning emptiness, right? But sometimes, how does he say it? It's explained that the mind perceiving it is also an ultimate, right? And you can imagine that, right? You'd say that's an ultimate mind, or it's the mind that perceives ultimate truth. And sometimes they'll say it's the ultimate truth, but it's not the actual ultimate truth. Does that make sense? It's the mind perceiving ultimate truth. But it's the ultimately true mind in some sense, or something like that. And then he quotes the 2 truths, also by Jananagarba, which says, since it is without deception, a reasoning consciousness is an ultimate, right? So among consciousnesses, the ultimate is that mind, which is without deception. And then he quotes Illumination of the Middle Way, which going back to Kamala Shila. Propositions such as ultimately there is no production whatsoever are also asserted to mean this. All consciousnesses arisen from correct hearing, thinking, and meditating are unmistaken subjects, and therefore called ultimate, because their objects are most superior. So now he's going to raise something much more subtle that I want to get into in a second. But first I want to point out a simplistic way, and actually when I was reading the commentaries to this, it's always the Lama had a very brief commentary, and so he just kind of emphasized this point, that one way of differentiating them is that, right, is that the actual ultimate is the object, emptiness, which is perceived, but you could say a concordant ultimate, or something also called the ultimate, is the mind perceiving it. Does that make sense? So that's the simplistic version. Now I'm going to get into the subtler version, which is what he's going to explore in great detail now. And it's led into by this quote from Kamalashila, where he says, all consciousness arisen from correct hearing, thinking, and meditating are unmistaken subjects and are therefore called ultimate, because their objects are most superior. What's their object? Emptiness, right? But here he's making a distinction. He's saying, Lama Tsongkhapa is, but also Kamalashila is, right? He's saying hearing, right? And remember, there are three types of wisdom, right? We often talk about that. The wisdom that's arisen from listening or study, the wisdom arisen from contemplation, and the wisdom arisen from meditative absorption. Right? And even with meditative absorption, there's a kind that's not directly perceiving emptiness, right? Like on the path of preparation, somebody has a union of calm abiding and special insight. That's meditation, right? They have calm abiding, but they've not yet directly perceived emptiness, right? And then there's somebody with calm abiding on the path of seeing who has directly perceived emptiness, or the path of meditation. So here Kamalashila is saying something that complicates things, I think, is my opinion, that he's complicating. Because he's pointing out that he says any of those minds are, as he say, unmistaken, are meditating on are unmistaken subjects, and are therefore called ultimate. But I want to point something out now, right? The mind that's a wisdom arisen from, let's say, contemplation, right, where a person is thinking about emptiness and they understand it intellectually, or more than intellectually, but they understand it through contemplation. That's not directly perceiving emptiness, is it? Right? That's a mind that has a correct conceptual understanding of emptiness. And he's saying that's an ultimate, right? That this quote is saying that's an ultimate, right? Because it's understanding emptiness, right? But that emptiness that it's understanding is not an ultimate truth in the way that Tsongkhapa defined it, right? So it's ultimate in the sense that it's ultimately true, but it's not an ultimate truth in the way Tsongkhapa has defined it. Right? You see why we're getting subtle now? This is good. Now we're going in he eased in, now we're going into the deep end of the pool or something. Right, so here, I guess I'm just pointing that out, right? Here he's just pointing out any mind, so somebody who just goes even if somebody were studying emptiness very deeply and they got some kind of understanding, right? They're if you were listening to Gyumen Khyentse Rinpoche teach, for example, or some other great Lama, and you're listening and you're really paying attention, you go, oh, wow, I get it, in a moment. You kind of get it dawns in your mind, right? He's saying here, that's the wisdom arisen from listening, right? And part of the definition of a wisdom arisen from listening, it's under the power of another. Right? It's through somebody else's explanation. It's not arisen through your own deep contemplation. Does that make sense? So that'd be an example of that, right? Somebody else, a great master, is explaining emptiness. You get some kind of aha moment. That's not yet through your own power of deep contemplation, but it's still a kind of understanding of emptiness, right? He's saying that mind it would be called ultimate. But is that the ultimate truth? Ultimate truth, remember, that's why I went back, right? Is the mind, is the object of the mind, is that which is realized by a mind of meditative absorption of an Arya, a special exalted wisdom that's directly perceiving the ultimate truth of meditative absorption? No, that's not that, right? So you're starting to get a sense of, there's the actual ultimate truth, remember we're going back, and then there are things that concord with it, right? Because they're about emptiness, but they're not the actual yet. You're starting to get the feeling for that. So now we're going to keep going. That's great. You guys are starting to get this. Okay, so now he says, of the two types of reasoning consciousness, the non-conceptual exalted wisdom of an Arya's meditative equipoise is without conceptions, whereas the reasoning consciousness comprehending suchness based on signs, or reasons, is conceptual, and so forth. The explanation in Bhava Viveka's Blaze of Reasoning, that with respect to the ultimate, there is both a non-conceptual exalted wisdom and a wisdom that accords with it, has the same implications as the explanation of the two ultimates in Illumination of the Middle Way just given. Therefore, the meaning of the text is not that the explanation of the two ultimates should be applied to objective ultimates only, without applying them to subjects. Does that make sense? So one point he's making is going back to that misunderstanding before. That misunderstanding, right, was that actually there were two totally different things, right? One was sort of realized conceptually through reasoning, and the other is beyond knowledge and unknowable, as if the concordant ultimate and the actual ultimate were two different kinds of phenomena. He's saying no, they're both, first of all, they're both emptiness. Right? And what's different about them is one is known conceptually, and the other is known through an Arya's meditation, or as he says it, right? There are two types of reasoning consciousnesses, right? One is an ultimate consciousness, right? A non-conceptual, exalted wisdom of an Arya's meditative equipoise, what we've been talking about. And the other is the one realized through signs. We're going to get into signs more in this section, but signs means reasoning. Does that make sense? Like conceptual reasoning. Which, and from Tsongkhapa's perspective, you only get to realize the non-conceptual through a conceptual process. Remember that. Does that make sense? Whereas nobody just suddenly realizes the non-conceptual. It's from Tsongkhapa's perspective, everyone who eventually realizes emptiness non-conceptually first realizes it conceptually, through some kind of reason, actually, right? Like Eddie gave all these examples of reasonings in this text, right? The reasoning of that which is, things are empty of inherent existence because they're dependently arisen. Things are empty because, we're going to get into this one in a few minutes. Things are empty of inherent existence because they neither exist as one nor many. Or things are, the self is empty of inherent existence because it's not one with the aggregates and it's not other than the aggregates. Those are all signs. I'm just writing what sign. Sign means reasoning, right? Okay. So now, how to separately posit the two reasoning consciousnesses, the actual ultimate and that which accords with it. So now he's going to get into more detail about how to do that. So he says, in this regard, the first is an actual ultimate, because when engaging in suchness, it is able to simultaneously eliminate the elaborations of true existence and dualistic appearances with respect to its object. That is also what is meant by beyond all elaborations. So that was the question you raised. Right. So I'll read that sentence again. That is also what is meant by beyond all elaborations. A conceptual reasoning consciousness is able to negate elaborations of true existence with respect to its object. However, it cannot eliminate, right, the elaborations of dualistic appearance. Therefore, it is an ultimate that accords with the aspect with the supramundane ultimate. So he's saying this is a subtle point about how do you differentiate the two. So, and I want to just go into detail about this for a minute, right? What he's saying is the actual ultimate, right, that's realized by the meditated Arya's meditative equipoise, right? On the one hand, it eliminates elaborations of true existence, right? There are different synonyms. Yeah, it's true existence, or inherent existence, you could say, right? And then at the same time, it's also eliminating all dualism, right? And they often say that, right? We've said that before. The Arya's meditative equipoise on emptiness, they say, is like, there are all different metaphors they use. So the most common one in the Gelugpa tradition, there are others too, but the most common one is, it's like, the experience is like water poured into water, right? In other words, because there's no dualism between water and water, right? If you have 2 cups of water and you pour them both into a bigger jar or something, there's no difference between the two, right? It's just water. You know, anyway, so there's not an experience of subject-object dualism from that mind's perspective. It's like the mind is, another way of saying this, the mind is completely absorbed in its experience of emptiness, so that there's no sense of a subject that's realizing an object. And whereas for the reasoning consciousness that's arisen through, that's not, well, let's put it this way, that's how do you say, that's not the actual ultimate, but that's the concordant ultimate, right? Meaning a reasoning consciousness that is not yet able to realize emptiness directly. If it's realizing emptiness, I said not directly, if it's realizing emptiness correctly though, it is eliminating elaborations of true existence, right? Whereas the person realizes things don't have true existence, right? The person identified the object of negation, which was truly existent object, right? Or self or things. Then by applying a reasoning, it realized that true existence doesn't, it's empty of having that, right? But there's still subject-object dualism for that mind. Does that make sense? That mind is like, that's why if it's through hearing, the person might even think, wow, oh, that's what emptiness is like. If the person is in deep contemplation, they may not think that, but there's still a subtle version of dualism. Does that make sense? And then for the person who's developed calm abiding and special insight on the path of preparation, right, which is right before, the path of preparation comes right before the path of seeing, where you realize emptiness directly. One way of describing that is that there's a conceptual, you would say it this way actually, like, well, I'm going to get into this in a second. I want to go into this in detail, but so for that person, they're getting less and less, what's the word, conceptuality. Their conceptuality is getting subtler and subtler. Their sense of subject-object dualism is getting subtler and subtler. So, like, so it's a meditative absorption, but it's not yet completely non-dualistic, meaning there's a kind of conceptuality. And I wanted to say something about conceptuality because it's implied in this. And this is true even for us about ordinary things, and then it's also true about emptiness. When you have what's the word? When anybody has a conceptual understanding, a conceptual understanding of something, what happens psychologically, according to Buddhism, is that you perceive that thing, but your conceptuality is mixed for you, for the person, in other words. Your concept of that thing is mixed with your experience of that thing. Does that make sense? And you're not able to differentiate them. So there's a sense of an I that's perceiving this, and the concept is mixed together, right, with that object. And so, that's true, for example, if I think, just an ordinary way, right? Like, actually, if you see, if you see somebody that you're very attached to, for example, right? You are seeing that person, but your concepts about them are mixed together with your perception of them, right? So you think, oh, they're wonderful, and I want to have, whereas that if you see somebody you hate, same thing, right? Like, you can't, you're not capable. A person could unmix those, but at that moment, you're not capable, right? As soon as you see the person you hate, like, your conceptual understanding of who that person is mixed together with your perception of them. That we're all familiar with, actually. We all have that experience, right? Even just like chocolate cake or something, right? Like, when you see, like, if you see chocolate cake, your concept of chocolate cake is mixed together with the seeing of chocolate cake, something like that. So that's how conceptuality in general works, right? Then when it's emptiness, the same thing, right? So in other words, the point of what I'm getting at is that it's not that the person who has conceptuality is not perceiving emptiness. It's that their conceptuality is mixed together with their understanding of, with their seeing of emptiness, right? And they're seeing it through conceptuality in a way, and they're not yet able to kind of see it nakedly, see it without that conceptuality. And so that's part of their way of perceiving it, and they don't yet have the power to be free from that. But that's wonderful, actually, for the person who's not yet. For example, if we've not yet seen emptiness, right, it would be wonderful to. If we've not yet seen emptiness, even conceptually, it's a humongous achievement to be able to see it conceptually. you know, there's some humongous achievement to be able to have that conceptuality become more subtle over time, because we're getting closer to actually seeing emptiness. But all, you know, but one only sees emptiness directly when one sees it directly, and that's a process that comes about through this through the kind of process I just described. First listening, then contemplating, then meditating, meditating more and more subtly, and eventually seeing it directly. That's the point. Now, go back to this thing of what are elaborations, right? Because he's implied there are two types of elaborations, right? One is the elaboration of true existence, right? And what he's saying here is both, you know, so somebody who realizes emptiness directly and somebody who realizes it conceptually are both capable of eliminating the elaborations of true existence. Right? But only the person who is realizing emptiness directly, the Arya, can also at the same time eliminate the elaborations of dualistic appearance, right, of conceptuality and of subject-object dualism. But the other person, the person who's realizing it conceptually, first of all, they have the elaboration of conceptuality, right? Their understanding is conceptual, and then that includes a sense of subject and object. Conceptuality includes the sense of, you know, there's a subject that's understanding an object. And that's a conceptual, what's the word? It's a conceptuality that keeps one from completely being like water poured into water with the realization of emptiness. Does that all make sense? Any questions about that? Because that's I think that's you know, that's what he's saying here. I just want to elaborate on it. It's funny. Conceptually. That's funny. Because that's all I can do. Yeah, that's all we can do.
I have a question, Lord.
Yeah.
So, so sometimes there's meditation, and you you're meditating an emptiness of the mind itself.
Mm-hmm.
So, at what point does that subject object dualism, like, is that like it disappears in the certain stages, or? Because you know what I'm saying. When you're meditating on the emptiness of an object, you know, phenomenon or whatever, but there's a point that there's also meditation that you meditate on the emptiness of the mind itself. Right?
Yeah.
So So in order to do that, do you have to have like a certain sense of non-dualism before that, or does that happen through that process? Of meditating on the emptiness of the mind.
Yeah, what is, I mean, so meditation on the emptiest mind, in a way, is what we, like, in the good tradition, well, in Kagyu too, I think, to some extent, but I mean, I think they would agree. But that would be Mahamudra, actually, right?
Mm-hmm.
In other words, that's what we label that, Mahamudra. And according to Tsongkhapa's presentation, it would be the same process, actually. Like, so in other words, you know, and actually it's an important point, because first you would have to be able to meditate. I was pointing out I'm going to go into a little more elaboration, more words. For somebody who's meditating on the nature of mind, right, first they actually have to be able to meditate on the conventional nature of mind, right, which is that which is clear, knowing, unobstructed. Right, so the person has to be able to meditate on that. And it's interesting, like, I'm going to point something out, like, whether it's that or even an external object, actually, as one develops deeper and deeper states of concentration, you know, gross, like, it's actually, this is a good question in a way, because it gets into a number of things. One is, you know, when we talk about conceptuality in Buddhism, I mean, it includes what we ordinarily talk about as conceptuality, but it includes something much subtler. And that's an important point. You weren't asked that directly, but it's implied in this point. Like, because sometimes when we say, oh, you know, that's conceptual or something, like, we kind of mean like intellectual. Maybe. Sometimes. I mean, sometimes if I were to use the word conceptual, like if I were to say to somebody, oh, you're being very conceptual right now, that could almost mean like you're being very intellectualized or something. Whereas in Buddhism, as it's being used here, like, conceptual includes intellectualizing, but according to according to this definition, the way it's being used here, like, insects have conceptuality. You know, if a wild dog jumped out at you and started barking, and you started to have a fight and flight response, that's conceptual from a Buddhist perspective. Does that make sense? I'm trying to give examples of things that ordinarily in the West we would talk about as like, you know, like the fear response, right? You would say, oh, that's not intellectual at all. That's a visceral response, right? From a Buddhist perspective, that's conceptual.
It's like every moment is conceptual.
Exactly. Every moment has all those things, right? Like, is your thing danger, right? Like, you're not even consciously thinking. And that's why I'm saying even insect. One time I asked Ken Shrimshed, I said, well, but insects don't have language in the way that we mean it. And he said, from a Buddhist perspective, they have their own language. In other words, I mean, you know, whatever, we would have to put human words onto it. Like, I mean, insects have a sense of danger. Like, I always notice that, right? If you pound on a table, insects go away. If you put a little sugar there, they go, they notice it, they go towards it. So they have a kind of conceptuality. This is desirable. But even as I say desirable, that's human language, right? But he was pointing out they have their own, in that sense, they have their own conceptuality, right? It's not with letters in the sense, but but there's a kind of conceptual construct onto things. And so in this sense, what's the word? Like, concepts in this sense are instinctual, actually, right? They're part of our instincts, and they come from past lives, according to Buddhism. So there's a kind of subtle level of conceptuality that's beginningless in our continuum, that's always been there, and that's how we, when a baby looks at their mom, and they go, like I was just, they go, like the mom smiles and they smile, and if mom turns away, they go like this, that's conceptuality from a Buddhist perspective. It's not, it's pre-verbal, right, in the sense that they're not going to say, they can't yet say mom, but there's from a Buddhist perspective, I'm just trying to get at how deep conceptuality is. Does that make sense? Now to go back to your question, so when the person's meditating on even the conventional nature of mind, right, which is just that which is clear and knowing, you could say, right, they're not yet meditating on emptiness. It's interesting in a way, because the person would feel, like if you were meditating on the conventional nature of mind, and you were getting good at it, you would feel, wow, this is like so, you would feel very peaceful, you would feel very like absorbed, you would feel very, some people think that's emptiness, which is not, but that's the conventional nature of mind. But the point I'm getting at is that, like, there's still a subtle dualism there. I mean, that's instinctual. Right? And then when the person would meditate, then the Panchen Lama in his Mahamudra text, he says, once the person has calm abiding on the conventional nature of mind, they then, with a subtle, he gives this metaphor I think is beautiful, where he says, like if you imagine, like, have you ever been, like, I remember once in the Canadian Rocky Mountains, I got up early, which isn't really my nature habit, but and I went out and there was like it was a lake, one of those lakes that's like that beautiful blue, but it was like a mirror, totally still in the early morning. There was no wind, right? So it was like totally pristine, like, and reflecting the mountains. And so he says, like, he's like saying the mind is like that. Does that make sense? Totally still. And he says, and then a very subtle part of the mind, like a tiny fish that doesn't disturb anything, turns around and starts to analyze the ultimate nature, emptiness, the ultimate nature of mind. And so again, one is, that's how you meditate on emptiness of mind, is what the Panchen Lama is saying. But the other is, there's dualism, right? You can, even in that very subtle state, you can start to go, wow, but the mind seems to be truly existent. It appears to me as if it's truly existent. I'm grasping it as if it's truly existent. And then you ask, is it truly existent in the past, in the future, or in the present? There are different ways of analyzing, right? So there's still a dualism there. And then what they would say is that once you realize it's empty, at first that would be conceptually, right? You would contemplate, that yogi would contemplate, and would realize conceptually, oh, the mind is empty. And they would have a correct conceptual realization. That would be dualistic still. Subtle, and again, I'm just pointing out, not dualistic in the gross sense of intellectual, right? But dualistic in that that's why I gave that whole introduction. It would be dualistic in that subtle sense, that there would still be some sense of a subject that's meditating on an object. That would be very subtle for that person. And then as they progress, that's where I was saying, like, on the path of preparation. So that's where a person already has a union of calm abiding and special insight. So there are like different levels of that: heed, peak, patience, and supreme mundane dharma. And I think that's interesting. The supreme mundane dharma level, which is the right before seeing emptiness directly, is where that subtle level of dualism is like so subtle it's falling apart almost, and finally it falls apart, and the person realizes emptiness directly. So there would still be this very subtle dualistic sense of a meditator and a meditated, even though it's the nature of mind. Yeah, it would still be that would be this view. That would be the view of. That's what Tsongkhapa is saying essentially, is that until that person directly realized the ultimate nature of their mind and had the Arya's meditative equipoise of special exalted wisdom, that they can't help it. There would be some subtle level of dualism still there. Does that answer your question?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, any other questions about that before I go on to the next paragraph? Okay, so then he says the relation, and item number 5 here, in relation to the perspective of these minds, it is necessary to explain 2 modes also with respect to the ultimate objects. So he says, it is necessary to explain 2 modes also with respect to the ultimate objects, the negation of ultimate production and so forth for forms and the like. For a reasoning non-conceptual consciousness, that emptiness of an object is the actual ultimate, always free of the 2 elaborations, right? Meaning the elaborations of true existence and the elaborations of subject-object dualism. For a reasoning conceptual consciousness, on the other hand, it is not an actual ultimate always free of the 2 elaborations, because it is only free of one class of them, right? And which class? The elaborations of true existence, right? But as we've just been talking about, that second kind of mind that's conceptual, because it's conceptual, it still has this subject-object, so some kind of sense, whether it's gross, if the person's realizing it through listening, right? Like they're listening to their teacher and they think consciously, wow, I get it. That's a very gross level of subject-object dualism, right? I get it. For the yogi who's on the path of, like I was just describing, a yogi who has union of calm abiding and special insight and is on the, patience level of that, for example, their level of subject-object dualism is much, much, much humongously subtler, but there's still some very subtle level of subject-object dualism that's like still, what's the word, instinctual in a way. It's there due to past habituation, and they're sort of gradually wearing away at it through their meditation on emptiness. So then he says, still, this is not to say that in general it is not an actual ultimate truth. So except for some minds from whose perspective all elaborations of dualistic appearances are gone, the emptiness of true existence cannot be free of all elaborations. Therefore, the meaning of the text is not that if something is an ultimate truth, it must be free of all elaborations of dualistic appearance. So there, what he's getting at, right, is that, it's an interesting sentence here. He says, still, this is not to say that in general it's not an ultimate truth. So the point being, if somebody realizes emptiness conceptually, they have realized emptiness, is one point. Does that make sense? And emptiness in general is the ultimate truth. Does that make sense? But if we're going to be technical about it, so that's why it is an ultimate truth, you could say. But if we're going to be technical, we would say, this is why this whole section is important. This is why he's exploring it. We would say, in general, have they realized emptiness? Yes. In general, is emptiness the ultimate truth? Yes. But then if you were going to be precise and say, is that the actual ultimate truth? If that person hasn't achieved that meditative equipoise, you'd say, well, no, it's a concordant ultimate truth. It's concordant with the ultimate truth, but they've not yet realized the actual ultimate truth, which is the experience, a certain kind of experience of a certain kind of mind, which is the mind of an Arya and meditative equipoise and direct realization. Does that make sense? So that's what he's saying there. And then section 6. The ultimate asserted by proponents of establishment of illusions by a reasoning consciousness is not an actual ultimate. So now, he says, this being so, proponents of the establishment of illusions by a reasoning consciousness assert that a mere object established by an inferential reasoning consciousness, the collection of the two appearances, that of a basis, such as an aggregate, and that of its emptiness of true existence, is an ultimate truth. It is a concordant ultimate, but it is not an actual ultimate truth. So here again, he's raising, and this is, you've gotten the sense of this, right? Tsongkhapa is often doing this. So here he's giving another example of somebody's position that he doesn't completely agree with, or that he's clarifying. So these are people, like where he says, what does he call? Proponents of establishment of illusions, right? So here he's saying, some people, right, will say that they, like if they're looking at a chair, for example, or a cushion or something, right, that they can be looking at the cushion, right, and they can be reasoning about its emptiness, and at a certain point in their experience, they'll be still seeing the chair, but they'll be conceptually understanding its emptiness. Right? Now, is there any way that that experience is beyond all dualistic appearances? No, right? They're actually having a very gross level of dualism. They're still seeing a chair, right? And so what he's saying here is sometimes those people say, that is an ultimate truth, right? And what he's saying is that's a concordant ultimate. If they are correctly understanding intellectually emptiness, that's concordant with the ultimate, but that's obviously not an ultimate truth, right? There's a very gross level of dualism in that experience. Next, section 7. It is inadmissible to prove that sprouts and the like appear to lack true existence with their appearing to be one or many. Now he says, this section took me, this next section I had to read a whole bunch of times to make sure I understood it correctly. This one it was difficult. So he says, also proving that sprouts and the like appear to lack true existence with their appearing free of being one or many does not have the benefit of such a proof for a person with understanding who has not eliminated doubt. Anyway, I'm going to pause and kind of explain it, because the wording I found challenging myself. But I'll explain what he's getting at here. Because and part of it is that he's getting at a number of different points about signs and reasons and so on. I'm trying to think where to start, because I actually think Tsongkhapa makes a number of important points in this paragraph here. So one point he's getting at is reasoning. I want to just kind of give us a context for a second, right? Because we've been talking about reasoning and signs, right? And I gave those examples of different reasons, right? Things are empty of inherent existence because they're dependently arisen, right? And one reason that Tsongkhapa himself presented in this text is, and this is the part, is a sprout is empty of true existence because it does not exist as one, and as a truly existent one, it does not exist as truly existent many. Right? Here he's talking about somebody who uses a different reason, but it sounds similar. That's why I got a little confused. Here the person's reasoning is the sprout appears to lack true existence because it appears to be free of one and many. That's a subtle distinction, isn't it? It lacks true existence versus it appears to lack true existence. Is not one or many, or appears to not be one or many. And so what I want to go through now is just to break it down a little bit is, the first thing is that, this is Buddhist reasoning for a second, so I'm just going to go off on a little tangent for again. I'm doing a couple of tangents there, but I think you have to do them to understand what he's getting at. Because he's writing for people who know these topics in a way like that. Right, so if I say, I'm going to use the correct reason for a second. The sprout is empty of inherent existence because it does not exist as one or many. That's a correct reason, according to Buddhism. Or that can be a correct reason, is a better way to say it. So I want to go through just the parts of that sentence. The sprout, that's considered the subject. Then, is empty of inherent existence is what they call the predicate, means the thing to be proved. That which is being proven. And then the sign, that's the term they're using in this translation, or the reason is because it does not exist as one or many. Does that make sense? And so the sign, or the reasoning, is supposed to prove the predicate, the thing to be proven, right? So the sign doesn't exist as one as many, should prove about the subject, the sprout, that which is to be proven, which is it's not inherently existent, or it's not truly existent. I want to just go back actually. I'm going to give a simpler example, like so sometimes they do this. It's the same point I'm making. I'm just going through the structure of a reasoning. I'm going to use the subject Jodi. Then the predicate, the thing to be proven, is impermanent, and the proof is she arose due to causes and conditions. Anything that, and in Buddhism, they would say anything that arises due to causes and conditions is impermanent. So the reason arose due to causes and conditions should prove that the subject, Jodi, is impermanent. Does that make sense? That's the structure of a reason. And that's the structure of reasoning in general in Buddhism, in Buddhist logic. That comes from the tradition, right, of what's it called, Dharmakirti, and any of those early Buddhist logicians. So there are a few points being made here now. Now I can explain. There are a few points being made. One that I think is quite interesting, actually, in Buddhist. I just find this interesting to contemplate, so I'm going to share it because he's getting at it here. It's in this paragraph. In Buddhism, this is interesting. A correct reason, right? A correct reason or sign. This is right. Not only has to be logically true, but it has to be something that the person, whether it's yourself or somebody else who you're trying to prove it to, can understand and can accept. So if I were to say to somebody who thinks, anyway, I don't want to go from too far. I mean, I'll slow down. So if the person is not capable of understanding that something is not inherently one and is not inherently many, then that's not a correct reason to present to them. That's what I'm getting at. Does that make sense? Even though that's true, if it's not something that the person you're talking to, or even if you're talking to yourself, that you're yet capable of understanding, then that's not going to be a correct reason for you or for that person. Does that make sense? And then another point is the predicate, the thing to be proven, right? In this case, it's what? Is empty of inherent existence. It has to be something that the person you're talking to has not yet realized. If they've already realized it, then there's no need to prove it to them. It would be a meaningless proof. So again, it's quite interesting, isn't it? In Buddhist logic, it's relational, right? In other words, you have to take into account, so if somebody's trying to realize emptiness and has not yet realized it, then this is quite important, right? So you would present that as the reason. So now you can go back to the sentence. Now we can go. I had to give all that context. Now we can go back to the sentence he wrote, right? So proving that, I'm going to go back to the very beginning of it. Also, proving that sprouts and the like appear to lack true existence with their appearing to be free from being one or many, does not have the benefit of such a proof for a person who has not eliminated doubt as to whether or not the basis truly exists. And then he says, for those who have eliminated the doubt, this sign, although a sign, is not correct. So there what he's saying is, he's getting at what I was just getting at. So he's saying, if a person has already realized, the second point, right, those who have eliminated doubt. So if the person has already realized that the sprout does not truly exist, then although that reason is correct reason, it's not relevant. It's not a correct reason for them because they already know it. So you're not proving anything new. Does that make sense? So he's saying that because that was that point I was just making. It's not a relevant one because to prove to somebody, it would be like, if I were trying to prove to Gabe that the wall is yellow, like Gabe already knows that, I think. So it's that would be a meaningless proof. Does that make sense? So it's like that. And then the first one is saying, if the person, what's there to say this right, has not eliminated doubt. In other words, the first case is the person who's not yet, it's not a correct proof, or it's not a relevant proof because the person's not yet ready to realize. That has too many doubts and is not ready yet to apply that reason. So it's the wrong reason to apply to that person because they have too many, because actually you have to be, what's the, say this right? As long as you have these doubts, that reason is not going to serve its function, which is to induce an ascertainment of that truth. I'm going to keep reading and then it'll explain more what he's getting at there. So in the illumination of the middle way, it says that both the sign, free from being one or many, and the predicate are mere eliminations. And that it is the same if it is neither one or many or does not exist as one or many. Either one of those can be taken as a sign. From these very examples, you can tell that these statements do not refer to affirming negatives. Therefore, this is not at all the assertion of the master Shantarakya and his spiritual son Kamalashila or the master Haribhadra. Now you can, by the way, I hope you're getting a sense now why this, for me, this paragraph, I had to read this paragraph about, and the commentary about 10 times to make sure I understood it correctly. Because I think he's making many points. One is what I just said. You saw that one, right? Where he's saying the reasoning, if you're trying to apply a reasoning to somebody who's already understands something, it's not a, even though the reason is correct, it's not a correct reason for that context. That's obvious. The one that's more subtle, that I think is going to be harder to understand, is the first one. For the person who has doubts, it's not going to serve. It's not going to serve as a correct reason. And I think that's what he's getting at here. And now, again, I'm going to have to go into a whole aside, but this is an important aside. This is actually an extremely important aside that applies to all the rest of this, for a number of other paragraphs here. And I can't remember how much I was trying to remember this last night as I was preparing. How much have we talked about Tsongkhapa's position on affirming negations and non-affirming negations? Have we talked about that in this class much? A little bit? Okay. So what he says here, this phrase, mere elimination, means non-affirming negation, or non-affirming elimination. And then he uses the term affirming negatives. And that's the important part of this. I was like, I had to read it over and over again. Oh, that's what he's really getting at here. And so the essence of what Tsongkhapa is getting at here is this, is emptiness, from Lama Tsongkhapa's perspective, is a non-affirming negation. And what's a non-affirming negation? Do people remember?
It's not saying what is there, it's just saying what isn't.
Yeah, I'll say it this way, like a non-affirming, I'm going to go to, this is what I was thinking about, because I was like, okay, people may not remember how clear. Like a non-affirming negation would be, I'm going to give an example of one. Like, there's no hippopotamus here. Like, first of all, that's true, there is no hippopotamus here. And secondly, that doesn't imply that anything else is here. Right? It's not implying some other thing. Right? And I'm going to contrast that for a second with, I was thinking of silly examples yesterday. So I was like, okay, I'm going to try contrast that with this. In this year's Kentucky Derby, there are no horses with purple hair. Again, that's a true negation. There are no horses with purple hair in the Kentucky Derby. But because of the context of that sentence, you know there are other horses in the Kentucky, right? The nature of a derby, right? The word derby implies there are horses, right? So that sentence is a negation, but it's an affirming negation, right? The sentence itself is disproving, is asserting, that's not really a proof, but it's asserting there are no horses with purple hair, right? The main thrust of the sentence is a negation. It's saying those don't exist. But because of the way the sentence is structured, right, in the Kentucky Derby this year, right, well, it's implying there are horses with other colors of hair. It's not saying what colors, but it's implying that something does exist. Does that make sense? So that's an affirming negation. I'm just using a simplistic example because emptiness is a harder topic. So you get it. So like a non-affirming negation negates something without implying anything, without implying some positive alternative or some positive phenomenon. Whereas an affirming negation, it negates something while implying something else does exist. Does that make sense up to that point? And so from Tsongkhapa's perspective, which he said, which he's following Chandrakirti's perspective here, emptiness is always a non-affirming negation. So you're negating the object of negation, right, which is true existence, and it's that simple. Right? So it's just you're understanding what is the object of negation. You're using a reasoning to refute that object of negation, but you're not implying some other thing exists in its place or something like that. And I'm just going to go off on a little elaboration again. Use that word funny. Tsongkhapa is following actually Chandrakirti and Nagarjuna, right? And what they would say, and what Tsongkhapa says in a way, is any affirmation of any affirmation in the context of emptiness would imply that something is inherently existent, which would be an assertion of a self. Right? So if you're saying the object of negation is the I is truly existent, right? My I. And so we need to negate that, right? That it's truly existent. But if you leave your negation implying, which is an ultimate analysis, right? We're engaging in ultimate analysis here. So if you engage in ultimate analysis and you're still affirming something, then you're saying that thing is truly existent, is inherently existent, exists independently. Does that make sense? And that, because that's ultimate analysis. And if you're saying that, then you're saying it's an ultimate self, right? Which totally contradicts Nagarjuna and Chandrakirti's perspective, which is that under ultimate analysis, nothing can understand ultimate. Nothing can, withstand ultimate analysis. Things do exist conventionally as mere dependent arisings, but no phenomena, even emptiness itself, cannot withstand ultimate analysis. So an affirming negation, so from that perspective, an affirming negation would be a reasserting of a self, actually, a reasserting of ultimate, a reasserting of, and would give rise to all the mental afflictions, and so on. So it's an extremely important point, right? That when you're doing ultimate analysis, it must be a non-affirming negation, meaning you're not asserting any ultimately existent, independent phenomena. So now, I'm going to go back. Now, because now, anyway, and that's the main point, I think, of this paragraph that Tsongkhapa's explaining here, because at the end here where he says, Shantarakshita, Kamalashila, and Haribhadra, who are three great Madhyamaka thinkers of India, he's saying they did not say, none of them say, that emptiness is an affirming negation. They all agree that it's a non-affirming negation. So what he's doing here is he's actually refuting somebody else who said, oh, they say it's an affirming negation. Does that make sense? And what is that? Now I want to go back to the very beginning of this whole paragraph, and hopefully we'll be able to understand it. The problem, because at first I was like, what's the problem? Because remember, Lama Tsongkhapa earlier in this text said a correct reason is the sprout is empty of true existence because it's not truly existent one and it's not truly existent many. I want to point out, that's a non-affirming negation, right? It's not truly existent because it's not truly existent one and it's not truly existent many. It's not implying it is any particular, right? Or is it all those, right? It's not inherently existent is a non-affirming negation. Also, that it does not exist as truly existent one and it does not exist as truly existent many is not implying it exists in some other way. Does that make sense? That's a non-affirming negation. It took me a while to get this, but if you read the first sentence of this whole paragraph on 291, it says, also, proving that sprouts and the like appear to lack true existence, with their appearing free from being one or many. The problem with that he's saying that's not a correct reason, right, for emptiness. Some people assert that as a reason for emptiness. He's saying that's not, and I was like, why is that not correct? They're not one, and they're not many, and they're not truly existent. But it's the word appear is the problem. When you say it does not appear to be truly existent, so it's appearing a certain way, right? So under ultimate analysis, here, that line of reasoning would say, under ultimate analysis, the sprout appears, right? It doesn't appear as truly existent, but it appears under ultimate analysis. So it must be an ultimately existent thing. So then there's an ultimately existent sprout, right? That didn't, an implication would be that didn't depend on the seed, How can it, and it didn't depend on water, that didn't depend on soil, that's untenable, right? That's not the view of Chandrakirti. That's not the view of Nagarjuna. So the problem is the word appear here. Appear, in that sentence, makes it an affirming negation. And when it becomes an affirming negation, it's not a correct understanding of emptiness. And that's why I was like, oh wow, that's it. Okay. So he's saying some people, I get it, now you can understand, right? He's saying some people misunderstood Kamalashila, Shantarakshita, and Haribhadra, and thought they were saying this reasoning, right? That sprouts appear to lack true existence because they don't appear to be not one and not many. And he's saying that's not a correct reasoning because that's an affirming negation. Under that negation, you would be doing some kind of ultimate analysis, but you would still have a sprout appearing to you. And a sprout, if you're doing, sprouts exist conventionally, right? They're conventionally existent things. But we're in the section on ultimate truths, right? And what he's saying is, a sprout is not an ultimate truth. And the appearance of a sprout is not an ultimate truth. Emptiness is an ultimate truth. Emptiness is an unaffirming negation. So if you're saying the sprout appears, is the thing to be the sprout and the like appear, right? So if appear to be to lack inherent existence is what's to be proven, then that's an affirming negation, right? Because it would be the thing to be proven is it appears a certain way. That's a positive phenomenon, right? That's not that's an affirming negation because it's implying an appearance at that time, which would not be an emptiness then. Does that at least make sense now? Okay. So he's refuting a certain wrong understanding of emptiness here, and a wrong understanding of what's the ultimate truth. Ultimate truth, and actually it's an important point. I just want to go into a little bit of an aside again to say something about this. Like, sometimes actually probably people have heard this, right? Like, I mean, that was very philosophical. I mean, I was using a lot of philosophical terms, and I'm going to say something that's not exactly what he's getting at there, but it's similar. Is that okay? Just to make it a little more experiential for a second. I want to say this, like, sometimes people will say, like, Buddha. I mean, in the context of Buddhism, I've seen things like this, where somebody will say, like, when you look at a mountain, just see the mountain. Like, let go of or refute all your conceptual elaborations about the mountain. That it's beautiful, that it's big, that it's green, or whatever, that it's, right? Like, let go of all your different concepts of mountain and just see the mountain. And that is the ultimate. And what Tsongkhapa here would say is, that's not the ultimate. Like, that's an interesting exercise maybe, to calm down somebody who has too much conceptuality. But is that the ultimate truth? No, right? For that person, right, at that moment, like if you let go of all your if you try to let go of all your conceptuality, right? So that's a negation, right? Like, okay, the mountain's not, like you might sit there and go, okay, I have all these elaborations. The mountain's beautiful and it's big and it reminds me of my time when I was in Colorado, but I'm in this other place or whatever, and it reminds me of this other thing. Like, I'm going to negate all of that and say that those are not true of this mountain. I'm just going to look at the mountain, as it is, or something like that, right? Like, that's fine to do, right? But what Tsongkhapa would say is, first of all, there's certainly still subject-object dualism, right? I'm looking at the mountain. That's there instinctually, right? Even if you're not consciously thinking, I'm looking at a mountain. And also, the mountain is appearing to you as if it were truly existent, as a mountain. And you're unconsciously accepting that appearance as true, which is a form of grasping at a self, of a mountain.
It's an affirming negation.
Yeah, so that would be an affirming negation, right? If I say the mountain from its own side, the mountain is neither beautiful nor ugly, right? That's an affirming negation, right? It's not beautiful or ugly, it's just really there, something like that. So that's not emptiness, right? Emptiness is recognizing I'm grasping at a truly existent mountain, and then checking, does the mountain exist in that way or not, right? And if you prove to yourself it doesn't exist, there is no truly existent mountain, right? And when you say there is no truly existent mountain, that's a non-affirming negation. Right? It's not implying anything else.
I have a lot of trouble with the affirming, non-affirming thing, because as soon as you label something, aren't you affirming? Aren't
Say what you mean.
affirming by saying with the mountain? Aren't you affirming that there mountains exist?
Well, that's why I phrase it this way. There is no truly existent mountain.
Okay.
That doesn't mean that there is a mountain. Or is this not, right? If you say there is no, like if I said there is no hippopotamus here, it doesn't imply there's something else here.
No, but it implies there are hippopotamuses.
Well, actually does it. Even, I mean, I'm just like literally, I'm pausing for a second. Because like, for example, if I say, because like a person could say that after hippopotamuses, is that, or hippopotami? I don't know how to say it right, have gone extinct, for example. Right? Like a person could still say that sentence. Or a person could say there's no unicorn here, for example. Like, so I don't think it doesn't inherently imply, or it doesn't necessarily imply, right? Because if I said, like if the sentence, there are no hippopotamuses here, or the sentence, there are no unicorns here, are similar sentences.
Yeah.
So it's not, actually it doesn't imply that there are hippopotamuses somewhere else necessarily, right? Because if I said there are no unicorns here, I don't necessarily believe there are unicorns somewhere else, for example. So the sentence itself doesn't necessarily imply that something exists.
I guess my problem is as soon as you label it, then it's a construct that exists for you in some manner. Whether it conventionally exists or not, or whether it ultimately exists.
Oh, I get you. And I guess part of what we're getting, I get what you're saying, I think, but tell me if this addresses it or not. Like,
Okay.
because, let's say it this way, like, part of what this, like, because what we're talking about is reasoning here, right? Like, and, like, so part of what we're getting at in a way is this, is like, I want to use an analogy that I think is the closest, actually, that I can think of to what's actually, when we're meditating on emptiness, like, that might help get at what you're getting at. Like, and the analogy I want to use is like, somebody who's, I'm going to use an analogy for a second of like, from the past of being a, it's hard to do actually, but by profession, being a psychologist. So if a person has a hallucination or a delusion, right? So they say, I'm showing you an example, like they say, no, there's so many examples of that. But if they say I'm the richest person on the planet, you know, example, right? Like, and they're actually not that wealthy. That's it, right? Like, so that would be a delusion. And if, I mean, sometimes you can't, actually I'm pausing and thinking about the reasoning thing. Oftentimes you can't reason with somebody, right? Like, and then you wouldn't apply a reason. But let's assume that they started taking medication and they were starting to get better, but they weren't quite there yet. And they were still caught up in the delusion, but they were starting to get more in touch with reality, right? And then you showed them their bank statements. And you said, you know, well, here's Jeff Bezos's wherever, and here's so-and-so's net worth, but here are the documents that are yours, and, you know, we've got them all here, you brought them in, take a look, right? And they were to look at the numbers, right, and say, oh wow, that's my, you know, this is my, like, these are my bank, my 2 bank accounts are here, and I see the numbers there. And then they would have a moment, that if it worked, right, as a reason, where they went, oh wow, I'm like, I really only have like $3,000. I'm not the richest person in the world. But then the idea, the delusion, I'm the richest person in the world would cease at that moment. the numbers would no longer be relevant at that time, right? Like in other words, whether it's $3,000 or $5,000 would at that moment be totally irrelevant. The experience, the person, if they were having a correct experience, the experience you would want them to have, it would be some experience of like, oh wow, that whole idea I had was false. Like, and they would sort of just like be like, it would be like this realization, because they had actually believed it. That's why I was using the example of a delusion, right? Where they'd actually believed it, and if the person was having a correct experience, they would just be focused on like, wow, like, and it wouldn't matter who, like, is, I don't even know, like, is Bill Gates or Jeff Bezos the richest person in the world? Is irrelevant at that moment. And do I have $3,000 or $5,000? Do I have another 25 cents in my pocket? So it's actually, $5, whatever. Like, all those things become irrelevant. What becomes all that's relevant at that moment is like, oh my goodness, that whole idea I had is wrong. And they would dwell on that. When the meditation on emptiness as a non-affirming negation works, it should be similar. In other words, so it's like using a reason that the person can understand to refute what's actually a delusion, really. Or is so the idea would be like and that's why if you look at like in Chandra Kirti's system, he talks about the word prasangika means absurd consequences, right? So like a reductio absurdum is that they sometimes call it, like in logic. But it's like so for example, like so if I like so with the sense of I, right? If I'm grasping at a sense of I, right? And then and I feel I'm totally convinced, like the delusional person, right? Because I am delusional actually, right? I'm totally convinced my I exists, and that if somebody insults me, it's very upsetting. If somebody helps me, it's wonderful. All that, like normal instinctual self-grasping, right? And then like if the reason works for a certain person, right, where they say, well, that I, right, like in other words, it's not, at first I'm not critical about it. It's just it appears to me and I completely believe it, right? And then if somebody says, well, that I, if it exists, it has to be one with your body and mind or something other than your body and mind. That's obvious, right? And if I accepted that, what's the word, pervasion, that idea, and then if I were to go like, well, then it must be one with my body and mind. Obviously, it exists, right? And I was like searching and saying, well, yeah, but I have to accept, like, it's not my left aorta, it's not my aorta, and it's not my left ventricle, and it's not my rib, and it's not all that, right? And then I go to the mind, and it's not in, like, my feeling of sadness because I was happy yesterday, and it's not in my distraction because I was concentrated, whatever, all that, right? And eventually, if I came to some recognition, there would come a point where I would be looking, well, it's got to be here, maybe it exists there, and if finally I came to some conclusion, like the person who looked at the numbers, but in this case, where I searched every possible possibility and then came to a conclusion, wow, it's not any of those. It had to be either my body, one with my body and mind, it doesn't exist. And then if I finally could realize it also doesn't exist somewhere separate other than my body and mind, then the experience would be that's similar, right? It would be this, that thing I grasp at really doesn't exist. At all. It never did exist, doesn't exist now, and one would sort of dwell in that. And I think what you're getting at is an important point, though. Like, if the person were then, because this happens sometimes. I just want to follow on what you're saying. Because in one way, I think you're making an important point. So the person would dwell then in that, would abide, I'll call it, in that state of recognizing it doesn't exist, which is like this delusion was false. Right? That would be the non-affirming negation. Then there is a danger of what you said, and the Guardian actually talks about it. The person some people then, it happens, that a person could go, well, okay, so the I doesn't exist, but the mind exists. And then they start to grasp that the mind is truly existent. Because I was searching the mind. And even though if the mind isn't the self, the mind does exist. Right? And the important part is that it's not supposed, what Tsongkhapa would say is, it's not supposed to be an affirming negation. It's supposed to be an experience that the hallucination or the delusion is the delusion. It's not. But if the person were to take that incorrectly as a proof that mind exists, then they would have to start all over again, right? Going, well, if the mind exists, it has to be truly, if the mind truly exists, it must be one with one of its moments or separate from one of its moments. And then you would have to do that analysis. until you came to the conclusion that doesn't exist. You know, and then a person grasps at moments, for example. You know, say, oh, well, what's not? You know, so I mean, it is possible that a person could
Right.
wrongly take it that way, but then they would have to keep refuting that grasping until they came to a place where they're not grasping at any truly existent thing, and then it would be an actual non-affirming negation. Does that address that?
That helps a lot.
Okay.
Thank you.
Cool. Okay. Okay, so then the next paragraph, which is number 8. The manner in which Majjhimaka proponents of a complete non-abidance assert that an ultimate is not in accordance with how earlier scholars explained it. So here again, he's disproving a wrong understanding. So the actual paragraph says, as for the elimination of elaborations that are the object of negation with regard to appearances, a distinction is made between an elimination, meaning a mere negation, and a affirming negation. Here he says determining elimination. I find that just, that we don't need so many different translations. I find it confusing. That what he's saying here is a distinction is made between a non-affirming negation and an affirming negation. Now he says, none of the great Majjhimakas assert an affirming negation. The mere object comprehended by an inferential consciousness is an ultimate truth. The explanation of their presentations in my extensive Lamrim should be understood along these lines as well. So what he's saying there is, he's making a number of important points. One is, he's saying there are no Majjhimaka thinkers who assert emptiness as an affirming negation. And then he's and what he's doing there is what he's been doing here is he's been refuting the view, and there are and I guess what I'll say this is that there are various views actually in Tibetan history or something that suggest, and also in non-Tibetan actually knowledge too, you know, in other Buddhist contexts, there are many different people who have asserted the idea of interpretations of emptiness as an affirming negation. And one point he's making is he's saying none of the great Indian masters of emptiness asserted that. So if you're asserting that, it's therefore not a Majjhimaka view, it's some other thing that's not a Majjhimaka perspective. Anyway, that's all he's really saying there. So I could give examples, but he's not getting into specifics, so I don't need to. Yeah.
I don't know if it's fair to say this is also along the lines of saying that, you know, emptiness, while an ultimate truth, is not truly existent. That's more, you know, maybe, you know, looking at it that way is appearance of emptiness, kind of like that concordant, but emptiness is itself empty.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And that's one of the 16 types of emptiness, first of all, is the emptiness of emptiness. You're right. And also, yes, that is there is sometimes people do that, and that would be an affirming negation. Whereas if somebody says, you know, emptiness is empty of everything except itself, because it's truly existent, that would be an affirming negation, which from Tsongkhapa's perspective would be a wrong understanding. So it's exactly right. I mean, that's one of the kinds of misunderstandings of these thinkers that you're exactly right, that he would, and in various places, brings up and says, that's an affirming negation, that's an incorrect understanding. Yeah, so you're exactly right with that.
Good, I'm done.
Then he says, paragraph 9, he says, although the negative of ultimate production and so forth is not a conventionality, that does not contradict the demonstration that it exists conventionally. So he's saying, in the course of explaining the negative of production and so forth as a concordant ultimate truth, Jananagarbha, in his auto-commentary on the Two Truths, says, others hold it to be only real, therefore also has the meaning of and. In fact, if analyzed with reasoning, it is only conventional. Why? Since the object to be negated does not exist, it is clear in reality its negative does not exist. And I'll read the explanation and then talk about it a little. So then he said, Tsongkhapa says, he is saying that others, Chitamatrans, assert, mind only, Chitamatran is mind only school, right? Assert that the emptiness negating a self of phenomena is the basis, in the basis of negation, is established in reality, while his own system teaches that since the object of negation, the self of phenomena, does not exist, the negation, that is the negative, is not established in reality. Therefore, the explanation that a negative of the ultimate production and so forth is a conventional means it exists conventionally rather than indicating it is a conventionality. Is that like very, no need for explanation? That's joking. I'm kind of joking. Again, these paragraphs are very dense, aren't they? He makes a lot of points in a few words, and sort of, there are a lot of implications of what he's saying, I think, often in these sentences. But, so there are a few points he's making. One is, Tsongkhapa is pointing out here that Chitamatrans, right? So he says here, Chitamatrans assert that the emptiness negating a self of phenomena in the basis of negation is established in reality. Right? So they would say, so he's saying that in the mind-only school, they call that, I think they call it like thoroughly established phenomena or something in the Chitamatra. There's that's a language in Chitamatra, in mind-only philosophy. So they would say, in their, actually, so Chitamatrans actually say that emptiness of phenomena, their perspective is it has to be truly existent, or it wouldn't exist. You know, and from their perspective, it's just quite interesting, right? From their perspective, they would say, like, they would say believing that external objects, for example, in terms of phenomena, the emptiness, they have two different types of emptiness of phenomena. I'll just explain one. There are two. The first type of emptiness of phenomena they talk about is that in the mind-only school is the view that external objects exist as separate entities from the mind, right? Is a wrong understanding. From their perspective, that's a wrong view, a wrong understanding. And when you realize that external objects don't exist as separate entities from the mind, you've realized their ultimate. It's an emptiness, right? They're empty of existing, independent with an independent, separate from the mind, a separate entity from the mind. And they say, when you realize that, you've realized the ultimate truth of external objects. And they would say, and that, like they would say, the idea that things exist separate from the mind is false, right? But when you realize that, that's the ultimate truth, and that's. As you say it, established in reality. That's ultimately true. That's inherently existent. They would agree with that. And that's it. So, so that's a Chitamatran view. Does that make sense? So Tsongkhapa's mentioning that. Then he's saying that this Madhyamaka thinker, Jnananagarva, doesn't agree with that. From his perspective, right? He's saying he's a Madhyamaka. Madhyamakas are not mind-only philosophers, right? And so Jnananagarva's own position, which is a Madhyamaka position, is that, and actually it's quite interesting, right? Because what they're saying, I'm going to go back. It's kind of interesting, isn't it? Like what he's saying here is that from a mind-only perspective, like the chair, right? I have this idea that the chair exists outside as an independent entity from my mind, right? And it doesn't exist that way according to the mind-only school. And so the mind-only school say that truth is, how do you say it? Exists in reality, right? And is inherently existent. Jnananagarva would say, wait a second. Like if you say, now he wouldn't say it doesn't exist separate from the mind. He would say the chair, I have this view that the chair is truly existent, right? Independently existent, you could say. And that idea that it's independently existent is false, right? And then he would say, how could a false idea not being true in and of itself be something inherently existent. It's just that something you made up that was false, you're recognizing it's false. That's not some truly existent thing that exists independently. That's just, it'd be like, it'd be like the person earlier, saying, it'd be like almost like the person, I'm giving it, being silly for a second, but the made up example I gave earlier, right? The person who said they were the richest person in the world, and then they realize they're not the richest person in the world, they would say, well, then that's my inherent nature. My inherent nature is not to be the richest person. Well, they could become the richest person in the world. That's not theoretically impossible, right? Like, that's not their inherent nature. It's just true that in that moment when they thought they were the richest person in the world and they realize they're not, they're not. That's, but that's not their inherent nature, right? So here he's saying something like that, like, it's totally silly. In other words, if you made up a false appearance and a false belief about something, which is that it's inherently, truly existent, and then you realize that's false, and then you say, oh, that's the ultimate truth that's truly established, inherently established. He's saying, and then hold that as a kind of independent phenomena, right, or some kind of inherent nature or some kind of truly established thing. He's saying that's just silly. That's not how it exists. Emptiness is also empty, right? That emptiness depends upon the appearance, like the emptiness of the chair depends on the chair, for example. We've gone through that before and so on. So that's one point. Then he's making another point, though. Actually, this is where it's dense. That's one point he made. Then there's another point he's making, which is that emptiness of the chair in general, is its ultimate nature, right? Its ultimate truth nature, right? But then he says, does that nature exist conventionally? And he says, yes, right? And there we're getting at something we talked about, again, we talked about this a little bit before. Like, from the perspective of the Arya's meditative, special exalted wisdom that's a meditative equipoise on emptiness, right? Realizing, if the person were meditating on the chair and then realized, if they were an Arya, right, and they were in meditation, they thought about the chair and then they meditated on its emptiness and they realized directly the emptiness of that chair, at that time, for them, that emptiness, that would be the actual ultimate truth nature, right? An actual ultimate truth. But then what we're getting at is, if later, after they came out of meditative equipoise, they were teaching about emptiness, right? And I said, oh, wow, that's really interesting. You were talking about the emptiness of the chair, right? At that time, that would be a conventional, right? I'm not realizing the ultimate nature of the chair in direct meditative equipoise, but if I'm listening to if that person were my teacher and I'm listening to them talk and we're talking about the emptiness of the chair, what he's getting at is the emptiness of the chair its ultimate truth nature? Yes. But when we're talking about it using conventional language with conventional truth minds, it exists conventionally. Does that make sense? So the ultimate truth exists conventionally for conventional minds, in conventional discussion or in conventional thought and so on. And so we're talking again about perspective here too. Does that make sense? So that's another point he's making. So that's when he says, therefore, the explanation that a negative of ultimate production, meaning the emptiness of ultimate production, and so forth, is conventional, means it exists conventionally, right? But it's not ultimately, it's the ultimate truth nature of the chair. But when you're looking at it from the perspective of a conventional mind, it exists conventionally, and it's something you can talk about, and it does exist in the sense that it is the nature of that chair, and you can talk about it, but you're not realizing it as an ultimate truth in that moment. You get my point there. Okay. So one more, maybe we can do one more, 2 more paragraphs, I don't know. So then number 10. The statement that when something blue appears, its emptiness of true existence appears to the eye consciousness implies an affirming negative. Therefore, it is not contradictory for its emptiness of true existence to be an ultimate truth. Okay, so anyway, then he's talking here about, in the same commentary, so by, I think, John and Agarba. So this also, if you have your own, the first part of this paragraph, of this quote, is actually an objection. Somebody's objecting, like how in a lot of texts, so Tsongkhapa does that, and here John and Agarba is doing it. So he's sort of, where they create, what's the word, almost like they create a character in the text to present a slight misunderstanding that then they can respond to, right? So this first, up to the point where it says, on the next page it says the answer to that is, that's the answer. So before that is a question, is an objection. So the objection is, since real production and the like does not appear when a thing appears, it is a wrong conventionality. Since the negative of real production and the like is a wrong conventionality, when a thing, the basis of negation, appears, it does not appear. The answer to that, it is not that it does not appear, because it is not different from the entity of the thing. So that's what John and Agarba said. Again, this is like dense, I guess is the word, but dense in the sense of like there's a lot to it. But one point that's being made here is there are various levels at which you can sort of, or levels of detail you can get into. But one point that's being made here is when a thing arises, its emptiness in other words, its entity is its emptiness, right? Its ultimate nature is emptiness at that time. So that's where he says, it is not a different entity from that thing, right? So the emptiness, the emptiness of a phenomena and so if a chair appears, somebody makes a chair, right, out of parts, right? They put together the parts and now it's a chair. The entity or the nature of that chair arises at the time the chair arises. It's already empty. So you don't have to later add an emptiness to it, right? The emptiness is naturally abiding, you could say. It's natural. It's its natural nature. It's its nature from the very beginning. That's one point. Because it's not something constructed, right? Emptiness is not something you add on or construct or it's the actual entity of that thing. That's one point. But then he goes into more detail. He says, the exclamation that whenever something like blue appears, its appearance of true existence also appears. So first of all, let's point out something. That's true, right? In other words, for ordinary people, when we see an object, we also see that object as if it were truly existent. That's the Majjhimaka, Prasangika perspective. There are some philosophical schools even within Buddhism that disagree with that, but that's the Prasangika perspective. Is when you perceive something, because of your past habituation with ignorance, you perceive it, it appears to you as if it were truly existent. That's Chandrakirti's position that Tsongkhapa is following. So that part's true. So it says, its appearance of true existence appears. But this does not imply, I added the but, that a mere elimination, the negative of true existence, appears to the eye consciousness. So there, what he's saying, the first point he's making is this, is so you see something, right? And it appears to you as if it were truly existent because of your past. So like you see a person, for example, or he's giving blue, but you see a person, that person immediately appears to you as if they were truly existent or inherently existent. And he's saying that appearance even appears to your eye consciousness, your ear consciousness. When you hear a sound, it's like you immediately grasp it as if it truly existed. You don't think, it never appears to you as an ordinary person as though it were a mere dependent origination. Right? That's not how things appear. But then he's saying, the fact that things appear even to your sense consciousness as if they were truly existent does not imply that the negation of that, the mere elimination, right, meaning that emptiness, the negative of true existence appears to your eye consciousness, right? What he's saying is, things do appear to your eyes, ears, nose, and so on as truly existent, but their emptiness does not appear to your eyes, right? The emptiness is going to appear to your mind through reasoning. Does that make sense? That's one point. Then, rather, it implies an affirming negative. Therefore, something like that has the characteristics of a conventionality, yet it is not contradictory for an emptiness, the mere elimination of true existence, to be an ultimate truth. So there are a number of, again, there are just a few points I'll make briefly. So one is, when a thing, as I said earlier, when a thing arises, its emptiness arises with it, right? But that emptiness is not going to be perceived by your eyes, ears, nose, tongue, and so on. That's one point. Another point is, the thing will appear as if it were truly existent to your mind, to your eyes, to your ears, all that, right? And if you're eventually going to realize emptiness, that realization of emptiness is going to come to the mental consciousness. And then it comes to the mental consciousness through a process of reasoning, a reasoning consciousness, right? That analyzes the ultimate nature of that thing. It's not going to come, and another point, it's not going to come, as I was saying earlier with the example of the mountain, right? It's not going to come just by looking at the thing, right? You could stare at the mountain for however long you want, for months, and you're not going to realize the mountain's emptiness by staring at it, right? You're only going to realize the mountain's emptiness by applying the reasoning process, right, of recognizing the object of negation, applying a reasoning that analyzes the ultimate nature of a mountain, right? Like you could do that, right, with a mountain. You could go through, does it exist, does a mountain exist on any of we know mountains are made up of atoms, right? For example, atoms are made up of subatomic particles. Subatomic particles are made up of even subtler particles and so on, right? But, so you could say, does the mountain exist on any of the atoms? So if you were to take one atom, is that the mountain? Another atom, is that the mountain? Another atom, is that, right? Or is that the mountain? And the mountain doesn't exist on any of the parts of the atom, right? Of any of the parts, any of the atoms. So, so you could analyze that. If you were doing an analysis like that, that would be an ultimate analysis, is my point. But just looking at the mountain is never going to give rise to a realization of the emptiness of the mountain. And that was what we were getting at earlier, like, that was where he talks about it affirming, right? You can do all kinds of affirming negations, where you're looking at the mountain but realizing it's not, whatever, it's not this or that. But those would be affirming negations. But emptiness is the non-affirming negation, which only comes about through the reasoning consciousness, analyzing the ultimate nature. I think there's time. I'll finish this section, because there was only one more point, and then we'll finish the section, which is this whole section on, what was it called? Divisions of the ultimate truths. Just that section, divisions. So the last one is item 11. The way in which the two reasoning consciousnesses, non-conceptual and conceptual, along with their objects, are posited separately as the actual and concordant ultimates is as before. Okay, so then Ornament the Middle Way, right, explains that although the negative of ultimate production and the like is included among real conventionalities, it is a concordant ultimate because it accords with the ultimate. As for the ultimate, it says that the entire web of elaborations, such as existence and non-existence of things, has been abandoned. As for the web of elaborations, it says in the auto-commentary to the Two Truths, quote, it is not empty, not empty, not existent, nor non-existent, neither produced nor non-produced. Such is what the Bhagavan taught. And why is that? It is without elaborations. Suchness is free from the entire web of conceptions. I'll just keep going, then I'll explain. As explained here, the web of conceptions is a web of elaborations. However, since those stop in the perspective of the direct realization of suchness, that is an actual ultimate, a reasoning consciousness, which is unlike it, along with its object, is a similitude of the former, and so forth as before. With regard to the negative of real production and the like, there are also two. The reasoning consciousness negates it, and the object of comprehension. So the way in which it is included among real conventionality should be understood on that basis. The manner of explaining freedom from the web of elaborations that exist in association with the two truths, this is that, and it is needed on many occasions. So first of all, this is a summary, really, isn't it, of everything that came before, so that's why it's good to conclude with this today. One point I want to make, just myself now, which is implied but not what Tsongkhapa is saying directly, is you can totally see, I think now, I hope you can see, but if you look at this quote, it is not empty, not empty, not existent, nor non-existent, neither produced nor non-produced, right? And this is what the Bhagavan taught. You can see actually how if you don't have someone like this is what His Holiness Dalai Lama once pointed out when I was in a large group teaching. You can totally see actually how if you just read a quote like that and you don't have something like this, how you could come to, like, I often feel very sympathetic when Tsongkhapa is pointing out wrong understandings that people have had. I'm like, I totally wouldn't think something like that. If I were just reading this quote and I didn't have somebody explaining in detail what the quote meant, it'd be so easy to go, well, it's not empty, it's not empty, it's not, like, like you could either think it doesn't exist, or you could think it's beyond it's unknowable. You can see how somebody would come to those conclusions that he was refuting, right? And so I think he's quoting again, in part here, like, to help us go, okay, now I get it. Like, it's not saying any of those things. It's not saying it's unknowable. It's not saying it's not an object of knowledge. It's not saying what it's, and what is it saying? What it's saying is, from the perspective, right, of the Arya's meditative equipoise, that special exalted wisdom directly realizing emptiness, there are no elaborations, right? There are no elaborations of true existence. There are no elaborations of dualistic appearance. And so from that mind's perspective, what's there to say, right? There's no conceptuality that is empty. There's no conceptuality that is not empty. There's no conceptuality that exists. There's no conceptuality that it doesn't exist. There's no conceptuality that it's produced. There's no conceptuality that is unproduced, right? Because it's free from all concepts. That experience is free from even the most subtle levels of conceptuality. They're all, what's the word? None of them are present for that mind, right? And so for that mind, there's an emptiness, a suchness, an emptiness, right, that is totally without elaborations and free from the entire web of conceptuality, right? Now it's totally clear. Oh, that makes sense, doesn't it? That's that experience of the actual ultimate truth by such a meditative absorption, right? And you can kind of read a quote like that and go, oh, okay, that's what that means. It doesn't mean it's unknowable. It doesn't mean, it's some truly existent thing that's separate from everything else. It just means that when you realize emptiness directly, all the web, right? And a web is a good metaphor, right? Because it's like you're stuck in it, right? It's like you cut through that whole web, and you're free from it in that experience, right? And so, from the perspective of the actual, mind of an Arya, right? When you achieve that, then you'll have this experience, right? That's completely free from that web, completely free. And remember, it's completely free from all elaborations of true existence, and it's also completely free from all elaborations of subject-object dualism, right? And so you're free from all, and what does he say there? The web of, he has this thing here where he says, the web of concepts and the web of concept, where is it? Perspective, where is it? Similitude. I forget how he exactly phrased it, but essentially it's free from the two types of elaboration, right? The elaborations of true existence, the elaborations of dualism and conceptuality. All those are cut off, right, for that mind. But then, what he's saying here is, now we can understand also why they make this, why it's actually important. I'll conclude with this. Why is it important experientially to have these two? Because this whole section is divisions of ultimate truth, right? And so Tsongkhapa made a choice. He didn't go into detail about the 16. They're interesting. You can study them. You can study them in Chandrakirti. But he didn't go into detail about those. He just mentions them, right? Then there are 4, and he mentions those. Then there's a division of 2, which is, emptiness, right? Ultimate truth, nature, emptiness of the self, and ultimate truth, nature, emptiness of phenomena, things, right? And that he's gone into in other parts of the text, so he doesn't go into that. That one kind of summarizes all the 16. Actually, if you understand that, then you understand the 16 and the 4, because that's a summary of those. But here he chooses to go into detail about this division: concordant ultimates and actual ultimates. And one point, I think, is that that's important because it's been misunderstood and it'd be easy to misunderstand it, right? That's one reason. But I think there's another reason, which is, like, we're aiming for the actual ultimate, right? That's the point. In other words, you won't achieve liberation without realizing the actual ultimate. But we also have to understand the concordant ultimate, right? Because the truth is, if this is what he's going to get into, he's gotten into throughout this text, this section, he's going to get into more, is we are at the level of where what we need actually is to realize the concordant ultimate, right? Because you have to realize that first, and then you have to familiarize with that for a long time before you realize the actual ultimate, right? And the only way, as I said earlier, the only way to realize the actual ultimate is by practicing with a realization of the concordant ultimate. So the concordant ultimate, I always think this, like, Yuba Kenshin makes this point, has made this point in various ways. So you sometimes say, like, with regards to various things, like even with compassion and bodhicitta, he'll say, like, oh well, there's this teaching on, like, it's similar. It's not the exact same point, but it's similar where they talk about give rise to, like, artificial bodhicitta. And sometimes they'll say, well, artificial bodhicitta is incredible. Like, we could think, oh, it's artificial, like it's phony or something. Oh, that's not. But it's like, that's all you have. Like there is until you're a bodhisattva who has spontaneous, natural, completely, where your whole being is imbued with bodhicitta, even in your dreams, and if somebody punches you in the face, you're imbued with bodhicitta. If you get, as you're falling down, I knew that story. Like, so if you're falling down the stairs, you'd be having bodhicitta. That's bodhisattva, right? As you're falling, you would be having that. Like, that's spontaneous bodhicitta. But how do you get? Panchen Rinpoche once said the only way anybody ever realizes actual bodhicitta is through artificial bodhicitta. It's through effort. Artificial just means it's created through effort, right? You have to kind of conceptually think, well, yeah, I'm kind of selfish, but it'd be better to be compassionate. And my selfishness actually causes me all kinds of suffering. But if I'm compassionate, I become happier, and others become happier. And it's rational, actually. Everybody's equal, and we all want to be happy. And so it's actually reasonable that the purpose of my life should be the welfare of all sentient beings. And you have to apply all kinds of reasoning. So that's the artificial part, is that it's created through your effort, right? But it only will ever become spontaneous if you create it through effort over and over and over, day after day after day, and eventually it'll become spontaneous, right? So we have to get to actual bodhicitta through creating effortful, artificial bodhicitta. It's the same, right? The only way we can get to actual ultimate truth, the actual ultimate truth experience of an Arya, bodhisattva, is if we create over and over and over again and how? Through study, through contemplation, and through meditation, which is how this all started, right? That quote from, I think it was Kamala Shila. So by doing what Kamala Shila says, which is creating with effort, creating a kind of concordant experience of emptiness by reading, by studying, by listening, by contemplating, right? And you'll notice in your own experience, right? Like, it's going to become, what's the word? At the beginning, it's going to feel very, what's the word? Like gross, intellectual, sort of like vague even, maybe, right? And then it gets more and more refined. Where you start to go, okay, I think I'm understanding it, right? That's the process. There is no other process, right? And then you, like, contemplate in your own experience over and over and over again, and you start to get little, like, some kind of experiences a little bit, right? The point is, that continues on and on and on, right? And all of those are concordant with. And what it actually is very profound. What is concordant with? It means, like, fits with, leads to, it's going to take you there, right? And so we should really value the concordant ultimate, because it's going to lead us to the experience of the actual ultimate. And then what he says is also that the concordant ultimate is actually, it's kind of funny, right? A reasoning consciousness is the object, right, so and in actuality, the last thing I'll say and then we'll stop. In actuality, that concordant ultimate is a conventional truth, right? It's in the sense that it exists conventionally, right? It's a consciousness of yours, in that case, right, that exists conventionally. Is it an actual ultimate truth? No. But it's concordant with the ultimate truth. It's really important. Its actual, like, sort of existential status is actually that it's a conventional truth, in reality. But it's addressing the ultimate nature. And that's real. I mean, not real. That exists. That's a better way to say it. That does exist. And it exists, and also, so how does it, what's the existential status of that experience? It's a conventional truth. But it's concordant with the ultimate, and it can be called ultimate. That's what's important. Does that make sense? So that's a summary of that whole section. Okay. Supreme jewel bodhicitta, where it has not arisen, may it rise and grow. Where it has arisen, may it not decrease, but increase more and more. In the snowy mountain paradise, you the source of good and happiness, all-powerful Chinrezig Tenzin Gyatso, please remain until samsara.